a regular occasion, and I can't even remember her number. So people, when they have to remember things, remember them better. And if you train your memory, you can really remember well. Also, look at the histories you've heard from the ancient world. These are almost always written poetically. We talked about the Iliad earlier. The Iliad is actually a poem, even though it's a history of the Trojan War. Now, why did Homer or whoever write the Iliad as a poem? So the details could be remembered. When you're reading something poetic and you use the wrong word, it will sound out of place. So therefore, it becomes more obvious if you've changed the details in your mind, and you can go back and find the right word from the original work. Just an example, in 10th grade, my English class studied Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. And as part of that study, we had to memorize either Brutus's or Mark Antony's funeral speech. Now, while Brutus's speech was shorter, I chose to memorize Antony's speech because it was poetic in nature. So listen to the first line of each. This is Brutus. Romans, countrymen, and lovers, hear me for my cause, and be silent that you may hear. Believe me for mine honor, and have respect to mine honor, that you may believe. Now here's Mark Antony's. Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. The evil that men do lives after them. The good is oft interred with their bones. So let it be with Caesar. Did you hear that rhythm in Mark Antony's speech? 4 times Antony said, quote, and Brutus is an honorable man. Getting into the rhythm and having that repetitive line, it was so much easier to memorize. And as I was reciting it to myself, I could pick up when I made mistakes because it just didn't sound right. Did that so well. My senior year, I took an introduction to drama class, mostly because I worked tech for the drama department and wanted that extra time during the day to get set up for the plays with the major drama people. But it was also interesting. I needed to fill a spot in my senior schedule. Final exam, I had to do a monologue. I chose to do Mark Antony's speech again because it's still mostly memorized. Because again, that poetic nature really helped it stick. In addition to this, significant events tend to stay with you in minute detail. Does the date January 28th, 1986 mean anything to you? If not, let me throw an extra clue in there. What if I mentioned that it is very significant to me as a space travel nerd? Well, if you still can't remember, I'll tell you. That was the date of the Challenger disaster. I remember it like it was yesterday. See, without DVRs, without VCRs, at least my family didn't have one at the time, I almost never had a chance to watch a shuttle launch live on TV. See, most of them happened when I was in school, and even if they occurred during the weekend or over the summer, well, we only had network TV, so I only got what the networks covered, which was usually only like the last 2 minutes of the countdown at most, and up until the solid rockets jettisoned. Now, I'd read about them. I wanted to see a full launch. So for Challenger, there were 2 factors that lined up that were going to set me up to watch a full launch. First was the presence of Krista McAuliffe, if you remember the teacher in space, on the flight. Because we had the civilian, this person not affiliated with the government except as a public school teacher, going up on the space shuttle, all 3 networks were giving a ton of coverage to the space flight. The second factor was the weather. In Atlanta, we had a snow day. I didn't have to go to school. I could stay there and watch the coverage of the launch. I remember waking up. I remember confirming on the radio that school was closed and turning on the TV to watch the coverage of the launch. I sat there for hours watching them as they described the mission, described the training, all these other things. Now, just before the countdown came out of its last built-in hold to start the terminal countdown, my mother comes in and told me she has to go to the grocery store and that I had to come with her. Now, of course, I begged her to let me stay home alone. I mean, I was 9 at the time. That didn't seem unreasonable to me. Or at least to wait 20 minutes until the launch was over. But she would do neither. I remember very clearly sitting in the left-hand captain's chair of our old Dodge conversion van, pouting while Mom went into the store. Yes, you heard that right. Now, she wouldn't let me stay at home, but I was free to stay in the car on a snow day, on an icy day, in a grocery store lot. So she came out and told me, hey, good news, you didn't miss the launch because the shuttle caught on fire. Well, at this point, I am losing my mind. I beg her to drive home as quickly as possible so I could find out what happened, because after all, we'd never had a shuttle catch fire. Certainly not on the launch pad. Of course, when we got home, we got the TV on, we saw it wasn't a fire. but the entire launch assembly, the orbiter, the fuel tanks, the solid rocket boosters, had exploded. And I remember sitting on the couch, glued to the TV all day watching the news coverage. I specifically remember that moment when Dan Rather first noticed and first pointed out the flash of flame near the aft mount of the solid rocket booster. This, of course, became a critical piece of information for the Rogers Commission investigation into the disaster. I remember arguing with Mom, or I guess maybe a better word would be debating with Mom, as to whether or not the explosion was violent enough to immediately kill the crew. I remember watching President Reagan's address to the nation. I even remember hearing the speculation that Michael Smith, the pilot of the mission, had caused the disaster by attempting to jettison the SRBs too early. This, of course, was proven wrong very quickly. I don't think it was even possible for him to do so. These memories are just seared in my head. But even if I wasn't a space nerd, I look at my wife. She didn't have a school day, but her school was watching the launch in her classroom. And the teacher flipped out and turned off the TV as soon as the shuttle exploded. That still seared in her mind. It was significant even to her as someone who didn't care about spaceflight. I'd bet that most of my audience has similar memories of the September 11th terrorist attack. I know I got all sorts of detailed memories of that day. The events surrounding Jesus would have been very significant as well, especially the resurrection. It certainly would have impressed the eyewitnesses and seared the details into their memories in a very similar manner. Third, to assume that those closest to Jesus were illiterate would be inaccurate. For one, we know that Jesus had a tendency to attract tax collectors to him. This was something he was often attacked for. And these tax collectors would have been well educated, not just in arithmetic, but in scribal traditions. They definitely would have been literate. Matthew, one of the gospel writers, was a tax collector. Luke, another gospel writer, was a physician. I would expect a doctor to be literate. Paul, who wrote about a third of the New Testament, was a trained rabbi. Rabbis definitely were literate because they were expected to read the Old Testament. Mark, another gospel writer, grew up in a wealthy home, so it's very probable that he got an education as well. So it's very reasonable to assume that there were at least notes or letters, since lost to history, that date very early after Jesus, which formed a basis of the teaching of the early church, which then formed the basis for Matthew, Mark, and Luke's gospel. Now, in Old Testament times, it would also be a misconception to assume these were all oral traditions for centuries. Moses, generally believed to have written the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Old Testament, was raised as a prince in Pharaoh's household, so definitely would have been educated. Now, early scholarship tried to argue that at the time of the Exodus, about 1400 BC, there were no written languages in Canaan. However, the Tel El Armana discovery, which was a bunch of clay tablets that's dated to around the time maybe earlier by 100 years than the Exodus, show that there was Canaanite writing. Now, Hebrew, in which Moses would have written, is a subset of Canaanite writing. The University of Tel Aviv performed a study, and in that study they estimate that in the 6th century BC, literacy rates in ancient Judah were somewhere between 15 and 20%. I mean, that's fairly paltry by modern standards, but it's very high against ancient standards, and especially high against the image we have of ancient standards. So it's not difficult to imagine that prophets of the day would have had no problems finding scribes to write down their prophecies. In fact, we will see in the book of Jeremiah that it mentions Jeremiah dictated the book to a scribe named Baruch. So on the basis of this evidence, especially ancient manuscripts and the reliability of oral traditions, it's quite reasonable to accept that the Bible is reliable, at least in terms of its faithfulness to the autographs. There are other considerations that indicate the Bible is reliable, not just in terms of how well it was transmitted, but in how well it conforms to reality. But that will need to be another discussion. Also with this, I've only really touched the surface of the evidence available to demonstrate the reliability of the biblical transmission. There's a ton more evidence available if you're willing to do the research. As I mentioned earlier, I'm going to start with the Gospels. These are the first 4 books of the second major division of the Bible called the New Testament. Specifically, these tell the story of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. Now, someone might ask, well, what does gospel mean? I mean, I've heard of gospel truth, but where does that come from? Gospel comes from the Old English phrase Godspell, which translates literally into good news. In the Greek, the word is euangelion, which can refer to either a message from a king or a favorable report about a significant issue. So the rest of the New Testament presents Jesus' death and resurrection as the good news. So these Gospels are the proclamations of the persons and events that make up this good news, that God intervened in history in order to bring salvation to his people. See, this is what makes Christianity different from all other religions. In most religions, they're all about what to do to reach up to God. I mean, I've heard people say that all religions teach basically the same thing, or all religions lead to God, or all religions lead to the same place, something along those lines. However, nothing can be further from the truth. In most religions, there's a series of laws one is expected to keep, and maybe they don't call them laws, maybe they call them rules or principles, whatever. They do this in order to obtain a reward from a higher power. Perhaps it's like Islam, where you're keeping halal and praying 5 times a day. In Buddhism, maybe you're designing yourself to eliminate your personal desires, or honoring and respecting your ancestors in Shinto. Don't get me wrong, I've greatly simplified these systems. I don't have time to go through all the details, but just want to give you the idea. Christianity says, on the other hand, that nothing we do can earn God's favor. Isaiah 64:6 even tells us, "For all of us have become like one who is unclean, and all of our righteous deeds are like a filthy garment, and all of us wither like a leaf, and our wrongdoings, like the wind, take us away." So in other words, even when we try to do good things to curry favor with God, we're not gaining points. I think about it like this. Have you ever owned an outdoor cat? If so, you've probably found a large number of presents on your front door in the mornings. I know growing up we had cats, and we always found decapitated chipmunks, squirrels. We once found a rabbit, innumerable birds. I mean, these cats were bringing us presents. They thought they were doing something to get favor from us. But honestly, if they're being fed depending on me being happy with them bringing these presents to me, they would have starved to death. Similarly, if our salvation is based on doing good works, we could never be saved. Thank God that Jesus, quote, who, as he already existed in the form of God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped or held on to, but emptied himself by taking the form of a bondservant and being born in the likeness of men. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Philippians 2:6-9. So we have to be careful when we're reading the Gospels to understand what kind of literature they are. Really, this is a good rule of thumb anytime we're reading the Bible. Now, we would tend to look at the Gospels as biographies of Jesus, and in a way, they are. But really, they're much more than that, too. Ultimately, these are theologies built around the person and work of Jesus Christ. So what that means is the order of events in the Gospels are not necessarily chronological. They're listed instead in a particular order the evangelist chose to paint a picture of Jesus. Now, while these are not biographies, they are not works of fiction either. They were not created long after the living memory of Jesus was gone. You've probably heard of C.S. Lewis, probably most famous for writing the children's series The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. A very famous theologian, but what you may not know is he actually came to know Jesus fairly late in life. He was trained as a literary critic and spent a lot of time studying ancient works of literature. He was a great scholar. About the Gospels he wrote, quote, "All I am in private life is a literary critic and historian. That's my job. And I'm prepared to say on that basis, if anyone thinks the Gospels are either legend or novels, then that person is simply showing his incompetence as a literary critic. I've read a great many novels, and I know a fair amount about legends that grew up amongst early people. And I know perfectly well the Gospels are not that kind of stuff." That was in Christian Reflections. In another writing, God on the Dock, he kind of expounds on that. Quote, "Now, as a literary historian, I am perfectly convinced that whatever else the Gospels are, they are not legends. I've read a great deal of legend, and I am quite clear they are not the same sort of thing. They are not artistic enough to be legends. From an imaginative point of view, they are clumsy, and they don't work up to things properly." J. Warner Wallace, in his book Cold Case Christianity, made a, I'll say, similar observation but from a very different perspective. Dr. Wallace was a cold case detective in California, spent most of his life as an avowed atheist, convinced that there's not enough evidence to believe in God. However, someone challenged him to read the Gospels, and the first time he did, he was struck by how similar these writings were to the eyewitness accounts that are so critical to his work. So here we have two very accomplished individuals, both of whom were at one point skeptics, both using their expertise to show that the Gospels are reliable. So to me, this seems to answer fairly well the claims some have made that the Gospels are later fabrications rather than eyewitness reports. So why do we have